Hey everybody, this is Brian aka Krosik, and we're going to be continuing our tutorial series on developing a platformer in Phaser. So today we're going to be mainly concerned with setting up the architecture for our different states that we're going to be having for the Phaser game. And states are, you can think of them as scenes if you worked with Unity before. Basically scenes are containers that you can jump back and forth in between that hold the actual state of your game. So in our case, what we're going to be setting up is having a boot state, a preload state, and then our main game state. And we're going to expand upon that later. But today that's what we're going to be doing. So let's come in here and we're going to make a new file here. I'm going to call it boot state. And this is going to be our boot state, of course. And what this is going to do is handle the configuration of the game in here. So anything that needs to be set up, like our screen resolution and everything like that, is going to be handled inside of the boot state. Now, since we're in TypeScript, all we need to do is have a class declared here, and then each state is going to have a property of game, which is a Phaser game, and this gets populated by Phaser automatically, so we don't have to do anything with this. You can automatically just be able to reference the main Phaser game object from your states. So three of the main methods inside of Phaser states, and I believe there's a few others, but these are some of the three main ones that we're going to concern ourselves with. The init, preload, and create states. And this is kind of the life cycle of the state. The init function is the one that gets called first, followed by preload, and then create gets called. And in this case, we're just going to use the preload function. If you were doing things that had to be sequentially ordered, you can have them in the init versus the preload, then the create. But for what we're doing right here, it doesn't really matter if we did it in the init or the preload. It would actually have the same effect. So we're going to do a couple things in the preload function. And the first one that we're going to do is actually set the scaling mode. And the scale mode is what we can do to tell Phaser how to scale our game. And since we're working with pixel art, we want everything to scale up nicely and not have kind of the anti-aliasing and the blurred pixels around the edges. We want essentially a 1x1 pixel to just become a 2x2 pixel with the same color and everything like that. No blending or anything like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to reference our game object, or our game property of the state. And remember, in every state you can access the main Phaser game object. And we're just going to set the scale of that in the scale mode. And the scale mode, again, tells Phaser how we want to scale it. And we're just going to use the property user scale to scale our game. And basically the user scale just tells Phaser that, okay, we want to have the game scaled by whatever we tell it to scale by. And in the next line here, we're going to tell it actually how much to scale. So by calling the set user scale function of the Phaser game, we can tell Phaser that we want to scale the game and amplify it by 2 times in both the X and the Y direction. So this essentially zooms in on the game by making, like I said before, essentially a 1x1 pixel, a 2x2 pixel. And therefore we can kind of deal with still these 16x16 based sprites and tiles and have them still look reasonable on a much larger resolution monitor. And to enable the crisp rendering of the pixels, there is the renderer property of the Phaser game, and inside of that is a render session, and we want to just set the round pixels property equal to true. And all this is doing is telling Phaser to don't mess with the pixels of the art. If you have a orange pixel, just make that a 2x2 orange pixel. Don't try to blend it in with the adjacent pixels or anything like that. So this will make our pixel art look nice and crisp when it's even zoomed in. And one other part of this is that we have to set the Phaser canvas and call set image rendering crisp, and we're going to set it to this game.canvas. So what this does is, from the actual Phaser documentation, it sets the CSS image rendering property of the given canvas to be crisp. And so basically inside of the web rendering of the browser engine that Electron is running in, or if you were just running it in your browser, it's essentially telling it to render as crisp, the canvas that the game is held in. So from there, we're also going to be setting up the physics mode. So set up the physics mode. And let's try to comment here. Set the scale of the game. We always want to try to comment our code as much as possible. Pixels, crisp. So when we come back to this, we'll actually know what we did. And so Phaser's got a couple of different physics modes that it can use, and the one that I've used so far and the one we'll be using here is the arcade mode. So basically we have to tell Phaser to actually start the physics system. So it starts looking for different physics objects and taking action upon them and all that kind of stuff. So it basically just does some configuration of the physics for Phaser. So we just pass it in the arcade property of the physics class of Phaser, and we're off and ready to go with that. Now that we've configured our game with some of the basic stuff, like properly rendering things, scaling them up, having them render crisp, starting our physics system, then we want to move on to our next state that we're going to be adding, which is going to be the preload state. And in the preload state, we're going to be handling all of our loading of assets, such as the images and tile sets and everything like that. So to get from this boot state to the next state, what we're actually going to be doing is calling the method state.start, and we're going to say preload state. This is going to be the name of our state that we want to switch to. So anytime you're calling state.start, you're just starting a predetermined state name. So where does this state name come from, right? In our main app TypeScript file, we can take a look there, and we're actually going to be setting up our states here. So instead of, let's switch a couple things here. Some of the things I want to do, and instead of setting a hard resolution of an X and Y value inside of the Phaser game, we're actually going to utilize the window height and width that we set in Electron. So that way, if we want to change the window, we can just change the Electron's window size, and automatically our Phaser game will scale properly with it. So what we're going to say is the window object, which is the window of the browser, and the inner width divided by 2, and then we want to get the height of the window divided by 2 as well. Now the reason we're dividing it by 2 is because we're scaling it up by 2. So this will make it fit nicely inside of the Electron window. If we don't scale the Phaser window down by 2, when we scale by 2, it's going to have scroll bars in the Electron window and stuff like that, and I can show you that in just a second. So what we're also going to do here is remove the default state that we're going to start. And we're going to be having that controlled a bit more manually. So we can leave the main state there. That's fine. We'll clean that up in a sec. But what we can do is start adding different states to our game. And what this does is it essentially tells the Phaser game that here are the states that we're going to be switching back and forth between, and here's the name of it. So if we want to actually do that, we can do that very easily. From the state property, we can just call add, and we want to give it a name, give the state a name. So for our boot state we just created, let's keep the naming the same and just call it boot state. And we pass in whatever the actual state is, the state object, which is going to be our new boot state object. And so this is a really easy way to add different states to your Phaser game, and so Phaser knows the name that you can reference it afterwards. So since we're not setting a default state for the Phaser game, we have to actually manually start it. So just like we did in the boot state, that we're going to switch to the preload state from there, we can just call the start function of the state property of a game, and we want to give it a name for the state to start. And so we can just start the boot state simply like that, because we set up the state here so the Phaser game knows about it, and we've given it this key or that name of boot state, and we can start it this way. And so this is a convention that Phaser has with a couple different things. So when you load an asset into the game, you give it a string as a name, and then you can reference that string later on and be able to pull up that asset that way. Okay, so let's go and create our preload state now. And in here, we actually don't have to do too much just because I don't have any assets at the moment, and so we'll work on putting all this stuff in later, but we'll just get the structure here so we've got everything laid out. So this is our preload state, and we're going to load all of our game data here. And so I'll call it a class preload state. And again, we have the property that is the Phaser game, is we can access the main Phaser game object in any of our states. So we're just going to have a preload and a create function here. So normally what we would do is we would load all of our assets in the preload function and then switch to the name the next state from the create function. So we don't have any assets to load right now, so we're just going to have the code in here, again starting a new state, and this is going to be our game state. So once the assets are all preloaded, we're going to go into the main game state. And let's go ahead and create that real quick. Game state. Oops. Go. Alright. And just like in all our other states, we can access the Phaser game object. We'll have our init, our preload function, and our create function. Now, two additional functions that haven't been covered in other states are the update and the render function. So the update function is where pretty much all of our main game logic can go. It gets called, I believe Phaser actually automatically limits it to be once, or 60 times a second, so 60 FPS, 60 frames per second. And each frame that iterates through the game, the update method gets called. And so here you'll be looking for player input, any collisions, anything like that. And the render function is actually called after all of the modules rendering happens. So in Phaser, pretty much everything renders automatically. So when you add a sprite into a game, it automatically gets handled for you. But what the render function is useful for is certain UI components that you might want to render in your Phaser game, as well as any debug text that you want to print to the screen. And so all that stuff will render after everything else in the whole game is rendered for that frame. So it's nice to have that function that we know is going to be called after everything is rendered. And so what we'll do here is we'll take our main state, and actually let's do this then. So we'll show you how everything flows through. So let's break this apart into our different states. So we already set everything up in our boot state as far as configuring how we want the game to look and everything like that. And in our preload function here, we're loading in an asset. So by the logic that we've set up, what we're going to do is just take that and put it in our preload state. So this is where all of our assets are going to be loaded. So let's load in this sample Phaser image in the preload state. And then from here, we're looking at actually adding the logo to the page. And so let's take this and put it in our game state. So once the game state actually gets reached, this will be created. Let's make sure we've got everything all set up. There's a couple things I know we're missing though. In our app, we've made two other states, but we haven't told our game about it. So let's add these two states here. So we're adding our preload state to the game object and our game state. Okay, so now Phaser knows about all three of our states, right? We're all set up there. So our boot states get started. So we go into our boot state, all of our configuration happens, then we go into our preload state. From our preload state, we load our single asset in this case, and then we start our game state from there. And in our game state, this is where all the update logic happens and everything like that. And in this case, we're just when the state first gets created, we're just displaying the image to the page. And that's about it. So let's see here. I'm gonna give it a run and see if this actually goes through properly. So as you can see, everything ran just fine. And actually, to show you that it's getting through all of these, let's go in and init. So we'll display a couple of debug messages so we can see that it is indeed getting called in this order. Okay, and one thing we can actually do with this, so why is this not getting printed? Oh, of course. So the one thing I forgot to do, which I forget to do pretty often, is we didn't have our compiler running. So we want to have our TypeScript compiler running, and again with the out parameter, and our single file that we're going to be outputting to is the game.js file. So once this goes through, compilation complete, and if we launch again, we can see that we are in the boot state and the preload state and the game state. And you can see that the scaling is certainly taking place, and that's gotten a lot larger. So a couple of things I want to show you real quick. If we go into our boot state, just to talk about the scaling, let's set the scaling just to 1 and 1. Hit the wrong button there. So if you can see here, the image is scaled up, but it's kind of weird. It's cut off and it's not looking right. So the reason we have the user scale set up that way is to actually be able to have it display properly. And of course the image is too big and it's getting scaled too large and everything like that, but it's displaying it as we would expect it to be displayed. And so if we want to actually come in here and change this, we can just go in here pretty easily, and this is our window that we set up for Electron, and we can just say something like, I don't know, 800 by 600 is going to be our window size. And from here we have the right window size, and Phaser's taking up the right amount of space. It's not, if you don't have Phaser render the window based off of the window size of the Electron window, you can have scroll bars over here and it gets all messy. But having it based on having the Phaser games window based off of the Electron's window size, it allows everything to be scaled nicely, and it's all compact, pretty much as you would expect a desktop application would be. So that's how we can do that. So what we've set up here is the basic architecture of our states, and we've learned a little bit about Phaser states and what they do and what they're useful for. And from there, we're going to actually start bringing in some assets into our game and actually doing some code and getting an actual game running. So thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.